everyone. Welcome back inside the UC Health Training Center for another episode of Broncos Now. As always, team reporter and host Sydney Jones here. And coming up on this week's episode, we'll take a look at the Broncos head coaching search, who owner and CEO Greg Penner and company has reportedly interviewed, and more. All that coming up. Broncos are on their search for their sixth head coach since the team's last trip to the playoffs following the 2015 season. Reportedly, owner and CEO Greg Penner and the team's ownership group are wrapping up their first round of interviews on Friday, which means there could be an announcement as early as next week. The team has reportedly interviewed Sean Payton, Ejiro Evero, David Shaw, Raheem Morris, D'Amico Ryans, Jim Caldwell, Jim Harbaugh, and are reportedly interviewing Dan Quinn on Friday. However, earlier this week, Jim Harbaugh announced that he will remain the head coach at the University of Michigan. To take a more in-depth look at some of these candidates, joining me here inside the Broncos podcast studio is fellow team reporter Phil Milani. Phil, thanks for joining me today. It's been a couple of weeks.
I know, I missed this. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. Did you take some time after the season to kind of
recharge
relax,
the batteries?
Recharge?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I am all in on the coaching search now.
Good. I love it. Yes, of course. We got a little bit of downtime, but as you know, things always pick back up around here. Of course, now with the search for a new head coach, Phil, we've seen several reports come out about different interviews that have taken place over the week. Of course, owner and CEO Greg Penner and company, they reportedly met with Sean Payton on Tuesday in Los Angeles. So let's start there. I know he's reported to be one of the favorites. So what do you think just makes him a great candidate for this position?
I think the experience that he brings, the credibility, that type of thing, just the fact that he won a Super Bowl, he's been there, he's done that, and he would just be able to come in and immediately change the culture in this building. I mean, I think that it would be like a night and day change. Like the second he got here, he'd start doing things the way that he wants to do them, and the whole mentality and feeling around the Broncos would completely change. So I think that he's that kind of a coach, very successful, won the division a million times down there. I mean, they always in the playoffs, and a lot of success on the offensive side of the ball. And, obviously Greg Penner, that was a big thing for him, mentioned finding an offensive identity. The fact that he had so much success with Drew Brees, and the fact that he knows Russell Wilson from spending time together at the Pro Bowl. Russell Wilson, after the final game against the Chargers, talked so highly about Sean Payton, so there seems to be a connection already there. And I think that there's a lot of reasons that make him the top choice right now. Yeah.
I know, Phil, he's being pursued by nearly every team that has a head coaching position open. The Panthers, Texans, Cardinals. Why do you think, or why is maybe the Broncos a more attractive, position here for him?
Well, the interesting thing about Sean Payton is that he's in the media right now. So, he's been giving a lot of interviews. Obviously, he's on the Fox pregame shows and stuff, and then also really close with Colin Cowherd. The other day, he was on Cowherd's show talking about what he's looking for in a potential new team. And he said the most important thing is the ownership group. And when you think about this Broncos ownership group, I mean, obviously they're the wealthiest owners in pro sports here in America. But more than that, they've said, look, we're willing to do whatever it takes to win. They are dedicated to winning. And when you have an ownership group like that, that gives the head coach the ability to win. And that's what's that's why everybody shows up to do this. So I think that this ownership group is really attractive. And also the Broncos as a brand. I mean, this is a big franchise in the NFL. I mean, so much success here, the 3 Super Bowls, the ability to really dominate the western part of the United States. The Broncos play in that afternoon time slot a lot. I mean, they're one of the premier teams in this league. So for a guy like Sean Payton, you're going to get the ownership group. You're going to get a team that is really good on the defensive side of the ball, has been for the last several years here, really since Super Bowl 50. This Broncos defense has been really good. And then if a guy like Sean Payton were to come in, he can work on this defense and work with a guy like Russell Wilson. Jerry Jeudy really came on there at the end. So Javonte Williams will be back next year. if they can improve the offensive line. There seems to be some pieces here that a guy like Sean Payton can really work with and have a lot of success. So there's a pretty good talent on this team, the ownership group, and the fact that this is one of the premier franchises in the NFL makes this a desirable job. And the other thing is, like, there's not 8 openings this year.
Right.
You know, there's not a ton of openings. I mean, you're talking about 5 openings, really. So I think that this Broncos job is really a desirable job right now.
Definitely. Well, Phil, you know, we saw throughout different reports this week and last week that the Saints won either a first-round pick or, you know, I've seen recently some people saying maybe 2 first-round picks. That seems a little crazy.
Yeah, I think that the other interesting thing about Sean Payton is that it's not just hiring a head coach. You've got to bring in the Saints here and have this whole thing work out between the new team, Sean Payton, and the Saints. And Sean Payton's going to have to negotiate this deal with the Saints to make this a reasonable situation.
Yeah.
And so Payton was on Cowherd's show earlier this week and said a mid to late first round pick because he's trying to leverage one situation. Then on the other side of it, the Saints are trying to say, no, it's going to be 2 first round picks, which is what happened when John Gruden was traded.
Right.
So they're trying to both play both sides of this thing here. Eventually, they're going to have to meet in the middle if it's going to work out. So that is an interesting thing because, like, say if the Broncos and Sean Payton, they mutually say, okay, we want to make this thing work, then they've got to bring in the Saints and sort of make a trade here because obviously the Saints still have the rights to Sean Payton. So that makes it a little bit trickier.
It makes that tricky,
and,
for sure.
You know, Sean Payton doesn't want to give up all these picks with his new team because then it hurts his ability to win. Right. So, yeah, it's going to be really interesting. And both sides are trying to sort of balance, you know, and leverage each other here. So hopefully if Sean Payton finds a team that he wants to work with, they'll be able to just figure something out here because it's in the Saints' best interest, too, to make this work because if Payton just says, fine, I'll just go back to TV, which he's threatened to do because those are he sort of holds the cards in that situation. Definitely. So he could just say, I'm just going back to TV. We'll examine this again next year. Well, then his value's not as strong. So next year, it won't be a first-round pick. It'll be less. So I think they have his rights through 2024. So it's sort of a tricky situation. It's an unusual deal. Very unusual. It's not just trying to hire a head coach. It's going to be something tricky here, but it could work out for the Broncos. You know, of course, they have the 49ers pick there, so that's a late first-round pick. Yeah. It might work out nicely there. But if they have to sweeten the offer, it'll be interesting to see just how much the Broncos would be willing to what they'd be willing to give up in order to get Sean Payton, maybe a third or a fourth, something like that, in addition to a first-round pick. So to get him, they're going to really have to want him.
Definitely. Well, Phil, I know you mentioned earlier that Russell Wilson, after the season, talked very highly of Sean Payton. We heard on Colin Cowherd's show on Thursday that Russell reportedly reached out to Sean Payton. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. Well, look, I think that whatever happens with the Broncos head coaching search, that coach and the success for this team, it's ultimately going to be measured by Russell Wilson's success. Right. You know, the new offense, the new identity, it has to play to Russell Wilson's strengths. And if it does, then the offense is going to get better and the Broncos are going to have some success here. So whatever happens, that is a must. And so the fact that Russell Wilson has reportedly reached out to Sean Payton, I think that just makes sense if you ask me, because ultimately whoever that coach is that comes in, they're going to have to be like, I can work with Russ. And so say a guy like Sean, if he wants to take this job, he's going to have to be like, I can work with Russ. I can, quote, fix him. That term's been thrown around a lot, which is so strange. It's not like he's like a car or something, you know. He's a human being here. So, but they want to fix him. I think that if it's a Sean Payton, he's going to have to say, yeah, I can work with Russ. I can make this thing work. For sure. And so for the fact that Russ has reached out, I think that it just makes sense, especially if Russ knows him.
Yeah.
You know, they've been to these Pro Bowls together. It's a small NFL community. These guys know each other. So I don't think that that's that big of a deal, even though some people in town have been making a big deal out of that. I don't think that that's a huge deal. I think it makes a lot of sense. And ultimately, if the Broncos are going to have success, the coach and Russell Wilson are going to have to mesh together and work well.
Definitely. They'll definitely have to have a good relationship.
And Russ, look, he's a franchise quarterback here. I mean, it makes sense for there to be some discussion there, some sort of communication. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I agree, Phil. Well, reportedly, another favorite is Cowboys defensive coordinator Dan Quinn. We, of course, interviewed him last year during last year's head coaching position. What is it that you like about him, Phil? What do you think he really brings to the table?
He seems like maybe like a sort of in the mold of a John Fox, when he came to the Broncos, a guy who will just be really steady. He'll be like sort of like the adult in the room, that kind of a thing where, look, he's been a head coach in the past. He's helped coach the Falcons to a Super Bowl appearance. A game really they should have beat the Patriots. An epic comeback there, but he's had success in this league as a head coach, and so I think anytime you have that experience and you're able to come into a new franchise, you've gone through those growing pains somewhere else. You've learned from that experience there in Atlanta, and now you can be better off for it with the Broncos. So I think he'd bring that experience. And also, I mean, he's a heck of a defensive mind. I mean, that Legion of Boom in Seattle, when he was the defensive coordinator there, the Broncos saw what that was all about firsthand, unfortunately. One of the best defenses of all time. And then the Cowboys this year, they've been really good on defense. So he would bring that expertise as well. So I think that while he might not be sort of like that sexy hire that like a Jim Harbaugh would have been or a Sean Payton maybe, he would bring a lot of stability, I think. And that's something that the Broncos have said that they want. They want some experience there where after hiring, Vance Joseph, Vic Fangio, Nathaniel Hackett, they've experienced those first-time head coaching pains. If you bring in a guy like Dan Quinn, he'll be able to hit the ground running and bring a little bit of that calmness, that steady hand that maybe a team like the Broncos could use some of that. Just somebody who's been there and done that, much like Sean Payton, but maybe just not to that high level. Dan Quinn, a lot of his success in Atlanta came while Kyle Shanahan was there. So some people have noted that. But I still think that Dan Quinn's an established coach in this league. And he also has a connection with Russell Wilson from their time in Seattle. So I think there's a lot to like about a guy like Dan Quinn.
Definitely. Well, Phil, last one here for you. Among the rest of the reported candidates that they interviewed this week, we got former Stanford head coach David Shaw, of course, Broncos defensive coordinator Jerry Vero, 49ers defensive coordinator
DeMeco Ryans. Yep. I know the one E kind of. Yeah, exactly.
DeMeco Ryans, Rams defensive coordinator Raheem Morris, and then Jim Caldwell. Out of that group, who's maybe someone that kind of sticks out to you?
Well, our friend Mike Kliss, a friend of the show here, he reported that David Shaw, the former Stanford head coach, is a bit of a sleeper pick, somebody that the Broncos really enjoyed interviewing. Obviously, Condoleezza Rice is part of this coaching search, and her connections there with Stanford. She knows David Shaw very well. And a few years ago, David Shaw was one of the hot up-and-coming coaching candidate. He had a lot of buzz around him. And some people might be concerned, he's just a college coach. But he was a successful NFL assistant for a long time. So I do think that a guy like David Shaw is well-respected, and he could be that guy who comes in and turns things around, would definitely bring a strong culture here to the Broncos. Although Stanford hasn't had that success on the field the last couple of years, I think a changing college landscape made it so that Stanford is a hard place to win nowadays. Just with the name, image, likeness, the transfer portal.
For sure.
It's hard to win at that high level. But look, he won a Rose Bowl there. I mean, they played in the Rose Bowl a lot. He was a multiple Pac-12 Coach of the Year award winner. So I think that he would be an outstanding hire. And then the other name that really sticks out to me is Jim Caldwell, the former Colts head coach.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's the Peyton Manning connection there. They went to a Super Bowl in Indianapolis there, and he is really well respected around the NFL. So he's another guy who's been a head coach. He knows how to do it. He can come in and hit the ground running. And I think he's just a guy who doesn't get enough buzz. I mean, but he's really well liked. He had a lot of success with the Detroit Lions, took them to the playoffs, you know, when that was like, wait, what? He took the Lions to the playoffs? Yeah. So I think that he's another guy who's under the radar, but could be a pick that for this Broncos team comes in a steady hand, a little bit like a Dan Quinn. And I think he could be a nice pick, although not that sexy hire.
Yeah. All right. Well, Phil, I guess we'll see what happens.
I know.
In the next coming
it's
weeks
like, gosh, like in the next week, it really could really have a lot going, depending on what they want to do for a second interview.
Right. Could be as early as next week.
Yeah. Maybe bring in a candidate, have him at the facility here, and then. Yeah, maybe at the end of next week or the next week after that, the Broncos might have their next head coach.
Yeah, it'll be here exciting. Before we know it. It is exciting. New era here.
Yeah, and hopefully a guy who can be here for a long time. You know, I think that
I agree.
Having that stability is really important. So we'll see what happens.
Like Greg Penner said, they got to get this one right.
They got to get it right.
Yeah. All right. Well, Phil, appreciate your time always.
Thanks you, Sydney.
For coming on.
Appreciate it.
Well, that'll do it for this week's episode of Broncos Now, Broncos Country. Thanks so much for tuning in. Moving forward, new episodes will be out on Friday morning, so make sure to follow the Broncos Podcast Network on Twitter and the Denver Broncos YouTube channel to stay up to date on all the latest episodes. I will see you next week.